In February 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The plan was a 12-hour, 900-strike aerial campaign designed to surgically decapitate Iranian leadership and permanently neutralize the country's nuclear capabilities. The strikes did assassinate the supreme leader, but the state's military apparatus survived the bombardment. Instead of collapsing, Iranian forces hit back asymmetrically. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps flooded the Strait of Hormuz. They deployed hidden naval mines, launched one-way drone swarms, and spoofed satellite signals to completely paralyze commercial navigation in the region. The United States responded by imposing a counter-blockade on Iranian ports. This created a dual blockade, effectively sealing off a waterway that handles 20% of the entire global oil trade. The macroeconomic shock was immediate. Brent crude oil shot past $120 a barrel. The spike in energy costs wiped out regional Arab GDP and forced European utilities to hike consumer price caps overnight. The attempt to contain the violence to a single regime failed, trapping the global economy in a cycle of severed supply lines. The kinetic blockade in the Gulf immediately paralyzed the microscopic supply chains required for the artificial intelligence industry. This satellite image shows Qatar's Ras Laffan port, producing a third of the world's helium, an irreplaceable gas for cooling silicon wafers. But liquid helium has a fatal constraint. It boils off within 45 days. Consequently, Asian chipmakers hold virtually zero active inventory. The region also supplies semiconductor-grade bromine, a highly specialized chemical sourced from Israel and Jordan. With kinetic warfare halting its refinement and export, that supply dried up. The AI hardware supply chain was already operating with absolutely no slack. Once the helium and bromine stopped flowing, it became physically impossible to manufacture complex components like this at scale. Tech equities plummeted, and the physical expansion of AI data centers bottlenecked into late 2026. The conflict in the Middle East severed the physical materials required to build the future of computing, stalling the timeline of the global AI expansion. At the same time, the unilateral launch of the war triggered a massive fracture between the United States and Europe. Core allies actively resisted the military operation. France, Spain, and Italy explicitly denied the United States access to their national airspace and critical military air bases. Washington retaliated. The administration publicly condemned European allies as cowards and issued formal threats to re-examine or even withdraw from NATO. While the West fractured, Eastern superpowers moved to manage the chaos. In May 2026, the US and Chinese presidents met in Beijing, driven by a mutual need to stabilize their domestic economies. The summit produced a few commercial agreements, including agricultural purchases and a data security deal for TikTok. But core structural friction points over Taiwan and the ongoing Middle East conflict went entirely unresolved. Days later, Beijing hosted the Russian president. They consolidated a Sino-Russian partnership openly designed to dilute Western power, though China remained cautious, using Russia's diplomatic isolation to secure heavily discounted energy imports. America's military overextension alienated its core allies and gave its primary geopolitical rivals the space to solidify a multipolar order. This leaves a critical structural question. Why do uninvolved developing nations disproportionately absorb the economic destruction of a bilateral conflict between the US and Iran? Global commodities like oil are priced almost exclusively in US dollars. This ensures that demand for the currency remains artificially high, granting Washington an exorbitant privilege to finance its foreign wars through massive fiscal deficits. This animated scale illustrates how exported inflation works. When a war causes global oil prices to spike, worldwide inflation follows. To fight domestic inflation, the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates high. That strengthens the dollar, pushing down the value of emerging market currencies. For the Global South, this creates a dual catastrophe. They have to pay vastly more for oil, and their depreciated local currencies make it nearly impossible to service their existing sovereign debt. This financial squeeze directly impacts physical survival. The cascading effects triggered a total collapse of the global fertilizer supply chain. 30% of internationally traded fertilizers and half the world's sulfur trade must pass through the Strait of Hormuz. When the dual blockade trapped those materials, and the disruption in Qatari gas exports destroyed the feedstocks needed to manufacture more. The agricultural market broke. Missing the crucial spring 2026 planting season guarantees systematic crop failures in highly vulnerable regions like sub-Saharan Africa by 2027. And because Western nations slashed their United Nations contributions to deal with their own inflation, humanitarian aid funding completely collapsed. In response, groups like the BRICS Coalition began building alternative payment architectures to bypass what they view as American financial coercion. The legacy of 2026 war is a systemic defection from the dollar-dominated order, leaving behind a world of agricultural scarcity and multipolar hostility.